Hello, sweet friends. It's Zuzu here, your time-traveling monkey friend with a cozy red cloak and a basket of old tales. Welcome back to Zuzu's Time Travel, the soft little corner where we curl up, drift back in time, and explore the slow, sleepy rhythms of history. Today we're traveling to the medieval countryside, not to meet kings or knights, but to walk barefoot with the quiet ones, the peasants. This episode begins a gentle journey called Why Some Peasants Refuse to Marry or Reproduce. Yes, you heard that right. While stories often speak of big families and bustling hearths, some peasants, quietly, perhaps even stubbornly, chose a different way. If you enjoy our little time travels, feel free to softly tap like, share the warmth, and subscribe to join us each week. No hurry, I'll always be here, waiting with another sleepy story. Now take a deep breath, and let's begin. In the world of medieval peasants, days didn't begin with alarm clocks. They began with light. The rooster's crow was the only bell that mattered, and when the pale blue mist of dawn crept across the fields, life stirred slowly to life. A peasant's day was not rushed, but it was long. A man might rise while dew still clung to the grass, pulling on the same rough linen tunic he'd worn every day for months. Women would stoke the hearth, their hands dry from ash, their hair tied back in cloth. Children, sleepy-eyed and barefoot, were already fetching water from the well. Labor was not dramatic, it was quiet, repetitive, and deeply woven into the earth. A farmer might walk behind a wooden plow, guiding a slow-moving ox through furrows of damp soil. Women wove flax into thread while humming soft hymns or gossiping gently with neighbors. The work was relentless, sowing, weeding, harvesting, baking, repairing, and often done in silence. There were no weekends, no holidays beyond the ones the church allowed. Even feast days sometimes meant more preparation than rest. And so, for many peasants, the idea of adding a marriage, a partner, or children into this already threadbare schedule may not have seemed like a blessing, but another layer of strain. When your back aches, your belly isn't always full, and your nights are short, the thought of raising a family feels less romantic and more like a gamble. Step inside a peasant's home, not a castle or a manor, but a small, low cottage with a roof of straw and walls made from wattle and daub. The door creaks softly, and the scent inside is a quiet mix of wood smoke, soil, and bread. The floor is made of hardened earth, swept often with bundles of twigs. There are no windows, only slits to let in light. A single hearth provides warmth, light, and a place to cook. Beds are shared, sometimes by an entire family, and made of hay and straw covered with coarse wool. Possessions are few. A wooden spoon, a rough cup, maybe a single iron pot passed down through generations. Chickens might wander inside. A baby might sleep wrapped in old linen near the fire while an old woman repairs a broken stool. Privacy? Almost none. Quiet moments? Rare. And when every inch of space is filled with duty and sound, some may have looked at this life and thought, why bring another child into this? Why add one more mouth when the roof already leaks and the bread is already thin? This wasn't bitterness, it was realism, and sometimes quiet resistance. Let's take a walk outside, to the fields just beyond the cottage, those narrow strips of soil owned by the Lord, worked by the peasant. Each day, those fields whispered a question. Will you eat this winter? Food was never guaranteed. One year, the harvest might be rich, with golden sheaves bundled high and root vegetables stored beneath the floor. But another year, a single frost or summer drought might leave cupboards bare and bellies growling. Bread, the staple of life, wasn't soft or fluffy. It was dense, hard, often mixed with rye, barley, or beans. Sometimes even crushed bark was added in times of famine. Porridge and onions filled most days. Meat was rare, perhaps a little bacon fat if the family was lucky. When the fields were generous, spirits rose. But when they failed, as they often did, children cried through the night, and mothers looked at their swollen bellies with fear, not joy. Some peasants quietly chose not to marry, not because they lacked desire, but because they could not bear to raise a child who might not survive the next harvest. In a world where nature ruled the plate, hunger shaped the heart's decisions. Living under a lord was like living under a constant shadow. Though the peasant tilled the soil, sowed the seeds, and harvested every stalk, much of the yield did not belong to them. At least a tenth would go to the church, another portion to the Lord. Rent was paid in wheat, eggs, labor, or coins, if the family was lucky enough to have any. If they kept bees, the Lord claimed the honey. If they brewed ale, he might take the first batch. The very bread on their table was never entirely theirs. To marry often meant needing land or approval from the manor. To raise children meant more labor obligations or heavier dues. A child might be sent to the castle as a servant or apprentice, far from home, just to fulfill duty. For many, this wasn't life, it was endurance, and enduring became easier when one had fewer ties, fewer risks, fewer hearts to worry about. So let me ask you, dear friends, if your labor barely fed you and your family's joy was taxed at every turn, would you still dream of marriage and children? Let me know softly in the comments. I read each one with care. Finally, let us sit quietly and speak of something not often spoken. Suffering, not dramatic, not loud, just the constant, aching sort. Medieval peasants lived in bodies that hurt, backs bent too soon, hands blistered from tools, feet cracked from cold winters and poor shoes. There were no doctors, only herbs and hope. A cough might turn deadly, a broken leg might never heal right. Women died in childbirth, and infants didn't always survive. Disease swept through without warning, and medicine was little more than prayer and poultice. In the face of this fragility, some peasants made a quiet decision, not out of bitterness, but of grace, to protect their hearts, to avoid loss, to escape another funeral under the village tree, and sometimes to simply rest, alone, whole, undemanded by others. This too was a kind of strength. Oh, friends, come with me now, back through the woods, past the village stream, into the lives of those preparing for marriage. It may sound sweet, a joyful union, flowers in the hair, and songs in the air. But in truth, for peasants, even love had a price. Let's peek into the life of a young woman named Melis. Her family is poor. They own no oxen, no extra land. Still, she is of age, and a kind-eyed boy has asked for her hand. But before there's any feast or vows, there must be a dowry. The dowry could be as humble as a single goat, a wool cloak, or a few loaves of bread. But to a family already scraping by, this was no small thing. It meant giving away part of their survival. And what if they had no dowry at all? Then Melis might never marry, not for lack of love, but for lack of coin and cloth. And for the groom, he too must pay the marriage dues to the Lord. Sometimes it was money, sometimes labor, sometimes both. Some even needed permission just to marry, and if denied, they'd have to wait, or sneak off to wed in secret, risking punishment. So many peasants postponed marriage or never pursued it. Not out of choice, perhaps, but because they simply couldn't afford to love. Now let's follow Melis after her wedding, which was small and quiet, just a blessing from the village priest and a shared loaf of bread with neighbors. Her husband, Elric, brings her to his one-room cottage where his old mother already lives. 3 adults, 1 bed of straw, a hearth with barely enough firewood. No real privacy, no space to breathe. Every task, every sigh, every step is shared. Melis learns quickly she is not just a wife, but a weaver, cook, washer, and field hand. Her hands never rest. From dawn until the stars rise, they chop, knead, gather, mend. Marriage is not a place of peace. It is an extension of work. Evenings are not spent in candlelit embraces, but in hushed exhaustion, stitching worn tunics or watching the pot boil, hoping there's enough porridge left for the next day. Some peasants watched others marry and saw not comfort, but confinement. They saw how the home grew smaller, how the burden doubled, and how love was often smothered under the weight of duty. So, they stayed single, not because they were unloved, but because they wanted space, and maybe even a little silence. Weddings weren't just between two people, they were public, watched closely by the village, and, more importantly, the church. Marriage was a holy sacrament. The priest would remind the couple of their duties, to be fruitful, obedient, and modest. He'd speak of Eve and Adam, of sin and sanctity, and of the dangers of lust outside wedlock. But more than that, the village watched. A new wife was expected to show humility, a new husband to show strength. If a couple didn't have children soon, whispers began. If the wife was too bold, or the husband too soft, there were murmurs. In small communities, privacy melted like morning fog. A kiss could be judged. A silence between spouses might spark gossip. In-laws added pressure, neighbors observed, and the local priest might visit to offer advice, even if none was asked for. This constant scrutiny turned some away from the idea of marriage. What was supposed to be intimate became another stage, another mask to wear. So some chose solitude, seeking peace over performance. Tell me softly, dear friends, would you have married if it meant living beneath 100 quiet eyes? When two peasants married, their bond wasn't just to each other, it tied them more tightly to the manor. Under the feudal system, peasants were often serfs, meaning they didn't own land. They worked it in exchange for protection. And when a man married, the lord sometimes saw it as an opportunity to increase labor. Elric, for example, now owed not only his own labor, but Melis's as well. She might be called to spin wool for the manor house, or to help bring in the lord's harvest, regardless of her own family's needs. If children came, they too were considered part of the lord's people. In many manors, newlyweds had to pay a merchet, a fee for the right to marry, especially if one of them was bonded to the land. Some lords even had first rights to approve or deny unions. Freedom did not increase with marriage. Often it shrank. Some peasants saw this and stepped back, quietly resisting by choosing not to wed, not to tie themselves further to a system already stretching them thin. Let's sit now beneath the linden tree and talk of something sad, but not angry. The weddings that happen not for love, but for duty. Sometimes two peasants were pushed into marriage by parents. Sometimes a lord arranged it. Or a widow needed a man to help with her field. Or a man needed a woman to care for his children. Love was not the reason, it was labor. The celebration might last a day with rough music and ale, but afterward, the joy faded. The couple lived as strangers, or worse, as quiet enemies. There was no courtship, no shared dreams, just shared roofs and expectations. Some peasants saw this happen to their siblings or neighbors and quietly made a choice, not to repeat it. Better, perhaps, to live alone than to share your bed with obligation. Better to grow old with your goats and your quiet thoughts than with a man who never laughed or a woman who never listened. And so, not all refusals were rebellion. Some were simply wisdom, passed down like recipes and prayers. Come, come, let's tiptoe into a tiny cottage at the edge of the forest. Inside, a new mother rocks her baby with a tired hum. Her fingers are chapped from washing linens in cold water, and her back aches from bending over barley fields even while pregnant. There's no cradle, just a padded basket near the hearth, lined with scraps of old cloth. Babies in peasant homes didn't have much. No rattles, no shoes, not even always a name right away. Some families waited days or weeks before naming a newborn, for many didn't survive those first nights. Swaddled tightly in rags, babies were kept still to preserve warmth and protect against injury. They were often tied to mothers' backs during fieldwork or hung in slings from ceiling beams while parents toiled. But when food was scarce, or when sickness crept into the village, the cries of infants could become unbearable reminders of helplessness. And some peasants, especially those who had buried too many children, gently stepped away from the idea of having more. not out of coldness, but out of self-protection. To love a child was to risk heartbreak, again and again. Let's follow the smell of boiled onions down the muddy lane to a home where 6 children crowd around a wooden table. The pot is full of thin stew, cabbage, bits of lentil, perhaps a bone or two. The father ladles it out evenly while the mother watches the portions carefully. There's enough for tonight, maybe for tomorrow. Feeding a large family was a daily act of mathematics. Every bite was counted. Every mouth added meant more to feed and less to save. When harvests were poor, and they often were, mothers gave up their own food first. Fathers went to bed hungry so children could eat, but children in time were expected to work. Little ones herded geese, fetched water, picked stones from fields. By age 7 or 8, many were already helping in the harvest. Still, there were years when even this was not enough. Some peasants, seeing neighbors buckle under the weight of too many children, quietly resolved to avoid the same fate. Fewer mouths meant fewer tears. So tell me softly in the comments, my kind friends, if you had little to give, would you still dream of a house full of children? Now let's walk to the edge of the barley field, where you'll see something tender and telling. A little boy, perhaps 6, pushing a wooden rake through the soil beside his mother. His tunic is too long, his hands are red from cold, but he works with surprising focus. In peasant life, childhood was brief. Children were not shielded from toil. They were seen as helpers, apprentices, even assets. The sooner they could carry, sweep, or sew, the more valuable they became to their family's survival. But this wasn't cruel. It was necessity. Fathers taught sons to plow and mend. Mothers taught daughters to spin and stir. And yet, each child working was also a child exposed to risk: frostbite, fevers, accidents with tools or animals. Some parents, especially those who had watched a child fall ill after long days in rain-drenched fields, began to rethink it all. Was it worth it? Could there be another way? A few simply stopped growing their families, not because they didn't value children, but because they cherished them too much to see them suffer. Let's step into the cool shadows of the village church, where light streams through narrow windows and incense clings to the air. The priest's voice echoes gently off the stone walls as he preaches about duty, family, and the sacred bond of reproduction. In the eyes of the church, having children was not only natural, it was holy. "Be fruitful and multiply," the priest would say. To marry and not have children was considered selfish. To choose chastity within marriage, even stranger. Confessionals were filled with whispered worries. "We've been married 2 years and have no child. I use herbs to prevent another." The church disapproved of such choices and sometimes punished them with penance. But even with these pressures, some peasants listened politely, then quietly went home and did what they thought best. Women passed secret knowledge of herbs, of timing, of spaces between children. Men, too, sometimes supported the choice, having seen too many little graves. The church offered rules, but the soil offered its own truths. Now, come with me to the edge of the graveyard, where wildflowers grow between rough stones, and a mother kneels silently beside a small wooden marker. Child mortality was heartbreakingly common. Fever, infection, malnutrition, any of these could sweep through a village and take the young first. Families buried babies wrapped in linen, sometimes in unmarked graves, sometimes beside older siblings who had already gone before. For the parents, grief became familiar, but never easy. Some couples, after losing 1 or 2 children, couldn't bear to try again. The fear was too sharp, the ache too fresh. They would love quietly, through shared work, through watching others' children, but they would not bring new life into a world that had taken so much. Others chose to wait, and wait, until age or illness made reproduction unlikely. This grief was silent, rarely spoken aloud, but it shaped many decisions. Not every empty cradle was unintentional. Let's walk once again through the cool stone path that leads us into the small village chapel, where sunlight filters through dusty air and settles like gold on the wooden pews. Every Sunday, peasants gathered here, not for rest, but to listen. The village priest would stand at the pulpit, hands folded over a worn book, and speak of sacred order, that marriage was good, that children were gifts from God, and that a family was the rightful shape of a Christian life. To remain unmarried was, in the eyes of the church, suspicious. Was it pride? Was it sin? Was it laziness or defiance? Those who did not marry, or those who married but did not bear children, were gently nudged, then quietly judged. Sermons mentioned the dangers of selfishness, the sins of lust outside wedlock, and the virtue of obedience. Yet many peasants listened with bowed heads and heavy hearts. They were not defiant. They simply knew the weight of each child, each responsibility, each whispered should. Some still married and bore children. Others, quietly, did not. Now come with me behind the chapel, to the garden where herbs grow and bees hum. Here, under the shade of an old pear tree, stories were shared. Stories of saints and holy ones who had never known the touch of another. The church held up many such figures as models: Saint Agnes, pure and unwed; Saint Benedict, who fled from temptation; even Mary, whose virginity was honored above all. These stories were meant to inspire monks and nuns, but their whispers reached peasants too. Some young villagers, especially those who were deeply devout, began to wonder, could they live a life without flesh? Could they offer their labor, their prayers, their silence to God, instead of to a spouse? They weren't all monks or nuns. Some stayed in their cottages, worked their fields, but chose to live alone. Their holiness wasn't public, but it shaped every action. And so, for some peasants, chastity became not just a virtue, but a quiet vow, a life of simplicity, devotion, and solitude. Step now into the confessional, that dark wooden box in the back of the chapel, where secrets were whispered and guilt laid bare. Peasants came here weekly, some trembling. A woman might confess she used herbs to avoid another pregnancy. A man might admit he had no desire for a wife. A young girl might weep over feelings she did not understand. The priest listened, judged, and assigned penance. Sometimes it was prayer, other times fasting. But always it was correction, a way to bring the soul back into alignment with church doctrine. And over time, some peasants grew tired, not of faith, but of fear. Fear of doing wrong, fear of being seen, fear of being punished for simply living as they could, not as they were told. A few stopped confessing altogether, others only spoke half-truths. Still others continued, quietly carrying the burden of being different. Have you ever felt that? The quiet ache of not quite fitting the mold? This one is tender and a little sad. In sermons and stories, women were often spoken of as the source of temptation because of Eve, who, as they were told, brought sin into the world. Girls were taught to cover their hair, to be modest, to avoid flirtation or pride. A woman who did not marry was sometimes called stubborn. If she spoke her mind, she was dangerous. If she kept to herself, she was strange. And if she never bore children? There were whispers, perhaps she was cursed, or worse, a witch. The church's words shaped how women were seen and how they saw themselves. Some internalized this shame, others resisted, but quietly, in ways that left no record. They chose solitude, friendship over romance, work over wedlock, silence over scrutiny. And in that quiet, some found a kind of holiness all their own. Finally, let us visit the abbey, its stone walls overgrown with ivy, bells echoing gently across the hills. Inside, monks and nuns live ordered lives. Prayer, silence, simplicity. But not all who admired this life could enter it. Abbeys were selective and sometimes expensive. Still, many peasants watched from afar with longing. They copied the rhythms, woke at dawn, said quiet prayers, chose lives of celibacy, not in cloisters, but in cottages. They were peasants in body, but monastic in spirit. Some fasted, some memorized psalms, some gave up marriage not out of bitterness, but as a quiet offering. The church had strict lines between the sacred and the secular, but the peasants blurred them. They made sanctuaries of fields, altars of garden walls. Not all holiness wore robes. Some wore patched tunics and muddy boots. Come closer, my cozy travelers. It's cold this morning. The wind bites through wool cloaks, and the earth crunches beneath our feet. We're in the final days of a bitter medieval winter, and the village granary stands, almost bare. During good years, there might be enough barley or oats to last until spring, but some years the harvest failed. Too much rain or too little, or frost that came early and killed the wheat before it ripened. So we find ourselves here, beside a mother opening the grain bin. A few handfuls of rye remain. She brushes away mold, murmurs a prayer, and begins grinding it into flour. There won't be enough bread for the whole family. Tonight the children will eat, but she may not. This is how hunger creeps, not with a roar, but with a whisper. A missing meal, a thinned stew, an ache that settles into the bones. And in times like this, peasants asked, can we feed another mouth? Should we? Let's step into the woods now, just beyond the village, where hunger drives even the meekest to explore. Peasants knew the land. They had to. When granaries emptied, they turned to the earth, digging up wild carrots, plucking nettles for soup, pulling sorrel and chickweed from between stones. Children were taught to recognize edible roots by shape and leaf, to avoid bitter berries or poisonous mushrooms. They boiled acorns, toasted dandelion roots, dried rose hips for their faint sweetness. Hunger turned foraging into ritual, a slow search for anything that might fill the belly without harming it. But some years, even the woods went quiet. Too many hands had already stripped the land bare. And in those years, parents looked at their children with worry. Couples looked at each other and thought, is now the time for more? More often than not, the answer was no. You'd think that spring was a season of hope, but for many peasants, spring brought its own special dread, the hunger gap, they called it. The stores from last year were gone, the new crops were not yet ready, and the body, already thin from winter, grew weaker with each passing day. Now imagine a peasant woman, belly full with child, nearing birth in early spring. She has no milk to drink, no meat to eat. Her breath is shallow. Her husband walks miles just to find a handful of dried peas. He returns with aching feet and little to offer. Even after the baby is born, there may not be enough food for her to nurse. The child weakens, the mother wastes, and the family silently prays for warmer days and ripening barley. Some couples watching this cycle made quiet pacts, not to try for more, not until they could be sure the spring would bring something better. Sometimes it did. Often, it didn't. Come with me to the village square, where neighbors gather around a communal fire, hands outstretched not just for warmth, but for comfort. During lean winters, generosity wore thin. Families who once shared bread now held back. The village that once sang during feast days now fell into quiet. Hunger turned community into competition, softly, silently. Children stole turnips from neighbors' fields. Dogs were slaughtered. Bark was scraped from trees and boiled into broth. People no longer visited each other unless they had something to trade. And in the silence of a cold cottage, a couple might whisper, "Can we bring another child into a world where even kindness has withered?" They weren't selfish. They were observant. And they saw clearly, love alone could not fill empty stomachs. Let's end this chilly chapter with the story of a woman named Alice. She once had 4 children. 2 were buried before their 3rd winter. The others survived, but barely. Each spring she sewed patches on last year's tunics and boiled weeds for supper. Now Alice sits by the hearth. Her hair is streaked with silver. Her youngest son sleeps beside her, finally strong, finally growing. A kind neighbor asks gently, "Will you try for more?" Alis shakes her head, not in bitterness, not in sorrow, just peace. No, she says. I've had enough winters. There was no word in her village for that kind of wisdom, the kind shaped by hunger and softened by love. But in her eyes it was clear. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was choose not to begin again. Come with me now, sweet travelers, to a time when the very air felt wrong. The plague, black, quiet, and deadly, arrived like a shadow. No one knew where it had come from, only that it spread fast. It slipped into cottages through shutters and under doorways. A cough, a fever, a swollen black boil on the neck. Then, silence. Villages emptied. Carts carried the dead to pits outside the chapel walls. Smoke drifted endlessly from chimneys, not from meals, but from burning straw, herbs, and infected belongings. Some peasants stuffed their windows with rosemary or sage, believing it would cleanse the air. Others tied cloth around their faces soaked in vinegar. But nothing truly helped. Those who survived did not forget. They remembered the silence, the smell, the way time moved strangely. Many who lost siblings, parents, even entire families, vowed never to bring another child into a world where life could vanish in a day. Let us now step into a quiet corner of the village chapel yard. There, beneath the elder tree, sit 3 small children. They wear cloaks too large for them. Their cheeks are smudged with soot. Their parents are gone, buried in the common grave outside town. These are plague orphans. There were many. Some were taken in by kind neighbors. Others were sent to monasteries. But some simply wandered. They begged. They slept in barns. They ate what they could find. Even the strongest hearts, seeing these children suffer, felt the sharp edge of fear. A young couple might look at these orphans and wonder, what if that were our child? It wasn't cowardice, it was clarity. Death had touched every doorstep, and the cost of creation now included not just hunger, but heartbreak. After the plague passed, it left something even more lasting than death. Silence. Fields lay fallow. Thatched roofs collapsed from neglect. Entire villages disappeared. Birds returned where people once sang. The rhythm of life, sowing, harvesting, birthing, was broken. In places where once 30 families had lived, now there were 5. And even among the survivors, something had shifted. Laughter grew rare. Feasts were smaller. People married later, if they married at all. Many peasants, seeing this new world, simply chose not to build again. A woman might live alone with her goats. A man might live with his brother and never speak of love. The memories were too close, the risk too near. They did not hate life, they just feared losing it all again. Can you blame them, dear friends? Now let's sit inside a small, warm cottage, where an old woman stirs a pot and tells stories by firelight. She speaks of the plague, of lost siblings, of bodies in the river, of priests too afraid to give last rites. Around her, children listen with wide eyes, not just to be entertained, but to learn. These stories were not only memories, they were warnings. Many children who heard them grew up wary. Even if the plague had gone, the fear remained. They saw the world not as a safe place to grow a family, but as a place where families vanished. These lessons shaped them, and when they became adults, some quietly stepped away from marriage, from parenthood, from risk. They chose simpler paths, quiet ones, not empty, but cautious. Finally, let's return to a young couple standing at the edge of their field. The earth is thawing. The barley is just sprouting. The sun is soft again. They've lived through it, the hunger, the sickness, the quiet. And now they wonder, is it time? Some peasants chose to wait until the world felt safe again, until the fields were green, until laughter returned to the square, until the old fears became distant echoes. And even then, some still waited, not out of fear, but wisdom, because they had seen how quickly life could vanish. But now, standing in this field, hand in hand, maybe, just maybe, they would try, not because they had forgotten, but because they had remembered everything and still believed in life. Come with me down this winding path, where the trees part just enough to reveal a small cottage at the edge of the woods. Smoke curls from its chimney, chickens scratch the earth nearby, and inside lives a woman named Lena, alone. She was once courted. A man from the next village, tall and kind, brought her dried apples in spring, but she declined. Not because she hated him, or feared him, or disliked love. She just preferred her own space, her garden, her goat, her quiet mornings, the smell of rosemary and rising bread, her own rhythm. In a world where marriage was seen as inevitable, Lena's choice was a quiet rebellion. She did not preach nor explain herself. She simply lived, tending her plants, weaving wool, and offering help to neighbors when needed. Some saw her as odd, others as wise. Now let's stop by the tavern, where an older man named Godric leans against the hearth, telling jokes to the younger laborers. He never married, never even courted seriously. In his youth, he traveled, worked with a blacksmith in the city, helped mend a bridge, slept under stars more often than under roofs. Some called him lazy, others said he just hadn't met the right woman, but Godric would shrug and sip his cider. "Wasn't for me," he'd say, then smile softly. He earned his keep, helped fix roofs, drove carts, sharpened tools, but in the evenings when others returned to wives and children, Godric wandered the fields alone, talking to the crows. His peace didn't come from love, but from freedom. He wasn't lonely, just free. Not every man wanted lineage. Some just wanted space to be. Now we return to the village green, where children gather near the old well, laughing. An older woman named Beatha sits beneath a tree, teaching them the names of plants. She has no children of her own. She never did, but she's raised goats, woven flax, treated fevers, and helped bring other women's babies into the world. When asked why she never married, she'd answer softly, "Because I was already full." Beatha passed on wisdom. She knew how to turn dandelion into wine and dock leaf into salve. When someone fell ill, it was Beatha they called. She gave herself not to one child, but to many. Not through birth, but through care. And perhaps that, too, is a kind of legacy. Let's take a slow walk past the cottage of Tilda and Mare, two women who share a home, a patch of garden, and a flock of ducks. They've lived together for years. When asked why they never married, they laugh and wave the question away. But in truth they have, in their own way. They share the harvest, the chores, the bed. No priest blessed their union. No banns were read aloud in church. But their partnership is quiet and whole. In medieval records, women like these were often labeled as companions or spinster sisters. But if you watched them long enough, watched how they folded laundry, fed the ducks, told each other stories before sleep, you'd see it for what it was. A life shared, a bond chosen, no children, no husbands, just one another. Sometimes refusal isn't loud, sometimes it's soft and lasting. At last, let's visit the old stone bench beneath the apple tree in the churchyard, where a grave is being tended, not by a child of the departed, but by a friend. Not all peasants died with descendants at their side. Some were buried by neighbors, remembered by those they had shared bread with, prayed beside, or helped during lean winters. Their names lived on in stories, in recipes passed down, in wooden stools they had carved, in memories kept alive by those they had touched. Legacy, you see, doesn't always wear a family name. Some peasants refused to marry, some chose not to bear children, and yet they left imprints in the soil, in the hearts of others, in lives made a little easier by their presence. So I ask you, my kind friends, what do you think makes a life well lived? Children of your own, or the love you leave behind? Let me know gently in the comments below. Come closer, dear friends. Let's sit inside a warm, quiet cottage kitchen, where the scent of dried mint and boiling porridge hangs in the air. Two women stand near the hearth, one older, one just wed, speaking in hushed tones while their hands busy themselves with kneading bread. These moments were common, a space where women passed on not just cooking or mending tips, but quiet wisdom. Not every couple wanted a child each year. And so, women shared what they knew, which herbs might delay a moon cycle, which teas to drink after, certain nights. They didn't call it science, they called it knowing. They learned from mothers, midwives, widows. It wasn't written down, it wasn't taught by the church. It was whispered over boiling pots and in the shade of the orchard. And this quiet knowledge shaped choices, helped women space children, or avoid bearing more altogether. Now let's visit the home of Marga, the village midwife. Her shelf is lined with little bundles, pennyroyal, wild carrot seeds, rue, tansy. Some were for easing labor, some for preventing it. Midwives were both revered and feared. They brought life into the world, and sometimes they helped control when that life began. No one spoke of it openly, but if a woman came to Marga with a downcast look and trembling voice, she might brew a tea or suggest a bath of specific herbs. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always safe, but it was a choice in a world with few. And so, behind closed doors, with no records and no prayers, women quietly shaped their futures. Not every peasant woman wanted a dozen children, and not every man expected her to. Midwives, quiet, skilled, practical, helped many make those decisions. Now come walk with me through the back gardens. Not the vegetable rows, but the little corners behind stables and under hedges. Here grow plants with names that carried weight: mugwort, parsley, Queen Anne's lace. Known today for other things, but back then, quietly understood to influence the body. Peasant women didn't call it contraception, they called it knowing the moon, or waiting the belly. They drank infusions after intimacy. They chewed seeds. They placed bundles in their bedding. It wasn't always safe. Dosage was uncertain. Some herbs were mild, others dangerous. But in a world where a single pregnancy could cost a life, they were still used. And sometimes, not to avoid a first child, but to avoid a sixth, a seventh, an eighth. Some used it rarely, others more often, but many gardens hid more than food. Let's now return to the village chapel. The priest speaks of sin, of family, of the holiness of life. But he says little about those herbs, about midwives, about tea brewed in secret. The church rarely spoke directly about such things, but that didn't mean they were unaware. There were whispers that women who avoided pregnancy were selfish or worse, witches. Some midwives were accused of unnatural knowledge. Women who miscarried were sometimes blamed for their own loss. And so the knowledge remained hidden, passed from woman to woman, never allowed in confession, never written in the parish book. And the silence was deep, heavy, but necessary. Because this wasn't rebellion. It was survival. Let me take you now into a kitchen near Dusk. A woman stands beside a boiling pot. She stirs gently. Her husband is asleep. The children are fed. She hums a soft tune. She adds a bundle of dried leaves, lets them steep, waits, drinks. She doesn't cry. She doesn't pray. She just sips slowly, thinking of the next harvest, of her aching back, of the baby she just weaned. She doesn't want another, not now, maybe not ever. The tea is bitter, but her choice is clear. This was how control looked in the medieval world, not bold or loud, but quiet, hot, herbal. A moment of agency, a pause, and that pause, for many women, was everything. Let's take a quiet walk now through the golden fields just after harvest. Look there. Two older men side by side, stacking wheat into neat bundles. They laugh softly, pausing now and then to share a bite of dried pear or a memory of rainstorms long ago. These two, Oswin and Matteo, have lived together for years. not as brothers, not as masters and servants, but as companions. They share a cottage, a dog, and a single strong horse. They never married. They say they had chances, but they always returned to one another. In medieval times, this sort of relationship didn't need explaining. It simply existed. Many peasants couldn't afford separate homes, so it was common for adults to live together, sharing work, food, and warmth. But sometimes it wasn't only convenience, sometimes it was deep affection, a kind of quiet love that didn't require ceremony or children, just loyalty, laughter, and a shared pot of stew. Now, let us step into a circle of spinning wheels. You'll hear the low whirring of wool being drawn into thread, the scent of sheep oil on fingers, and the sound of women talking. This was the cloth guild, the weaver's corner, the afternoon gathering in the cottage of old Myra. Among the women who came here, widows, unmarried girls, midwives, and wives, there was a web of care that had nothing to do with husbands or children. They brought food for one another, shared firewood, helped when someone fell ill, laughed together when the spinning was slow, grieved together when someone passed. It was friendship, but also family, a chosen family. Some women never left this circle. They aged within it, found meaning in it, and when they died, they were remembered with as much tenderness as any mother, and perhaps even more. Come now into a modest kitchen where 4 peasants sit close around a fire. They've lived together since they were young, orphaned siblings, neighbors drawn together, friends who never parted ways. They aren't married, they never bore children, yet they move around one another like a family. One stirs the stew, another fixes a broken stool, one mends boots by the door. Their silence is not awkward, it's the silence of knowing. Medieval life was hard, but it wasn't only about survival, it was also about who you chose to survive with. Many peasants found deep companionship in non-romantic relationships. These ties, maintained through years of hardship, offered a gentler kind of fulfillment. Not all homes were filled with spouses and babies. Some were filled with friends, with shared chores, laughter, stories, and trust. And that, too, was enough. Let's walk now down a winding road, 2 figures ahead, cloaks flapping in the breeze, packs slung over their backs. Wandering was rare, but not unheard of. Pilgrims, traveling laborers, and musicians sometimes walked from village to village, and often they walked in pairs. A pair of traveling tanners, a pair of scribes, a pair of flute players. Not married, not wealthy, but bonded. They'd sleep in haylofts, play music at fairs, help with threshing, or carve spoons in exchange for bread. They weren't settled, but they weren't lost. Some peasants admired them, others pitied them, but many wondered, could I live like that? With one companion, nothing fixed, but free? And some did, not for riches or glory, but for the companionship of the road. Now, come sit beside the fire as twilight falls. Let me tell you about Alwyn and Elsbeth, 2 women who lived together in a small, ivy-covered home at the edge of the village. They never spoke of love, but they were always side by side. Elsbeth tilled the garden. Alwyn baked bread. At night they read psalms. During storms they sat by the window and watched the trees sway. They didn't call it anything, and no one asked. They weren't wives, they weren't mothers, but they were home to each other. In the quiet corners of medieval life, there were many such pairings. No bands, no heirs, no land passed down, only steady affection. And for many, that was not just enough, it was everything. Come with me now, softly, into a quiet stone cottage. The shutters are closed, a candle burns low, a woman is in labor, her face pale, her brow slick with sweat. 2 midwives kneel at her side, one murmurs encouragement, the other prepares cloth and warm water. Outside, a friend tends the fire. Children have been sent away, the village holds its breath. In medieval times, childbirth was as dangerous as battle. No pain relief, no sterile instruments, no real medical training. Just women, working from memory and instinct. Some births ended with joy, a healthy baby's first cry, a mother exhaling relief, but many others did not. Every woman knew the risks, every girl heard the stories. A birth that began at dawn could end in silence by nightfall, and so the birthing room became a sacred space, not just for life to enter, but for life to balance on the edge. Let's pause now at the village chapel. A young husband kneels in prayer, his hands trembling. His wife is in labor back at home, and he is afraid. Nearby, a midwife lights a small candle, a ritual not just for hope, but for protection. Before giving birth, many women made peace with the idea that they might not survive. They prepared their souls. Some confessed to the priest, others set aside a cloth for burial, just in case. A few even whispered goodbye to their children. This wasn't dramatic, it was practical. In some places, mothers were told to make ready as if for war, because birth was war, and in knowing that, some women and their husbands quietly decided once was enough. Not every death was physical. Some were the death of joy, of certainty, of safety. And it changed how peasants thought about parenthood. After a birth, there was silence. If the mother survived, she was expected to lie in for weeks to rest, heal, and be cared for. But often that care was brief or insufficient. The chores still needed doing, other children still needed food, and her body, torn, bloodied, weakened, wasn't always ready to return. Many women suffered infections. Some bled slowly for days. Others developed milk fever, which could burn through the body like fire. There were no antibiotics, no clean tools, no understanding of hygiene. Even women who lived were never the same. Some walked with limps. Others lost their ability to bear more children. Many lived with chronic pain, and for the next generation of girls, watching their mothers suffer, fear rooted deep. Not fear of children, but of what it might cost to bring them into the world. Let us now walk quietly to the graveyard, where small wooden crosses lean in the soil. Here lie women who bore life and lost their own. You'll notice the dates. Many died in their 20s or 30s. Some died the same day their child was born. Some didn't live to name them. A neighbor might have cared for the baby. A husband might remarry within the year. But the absence of the mother lingered. It lingered in lullabies, in the way a child looked at her picture, in the silences at the dinner table. And for other women, pregnant again, watching the graveyard grow, the fear solidified. Some swore silent oaths, no more children, no more risk, no more goodbye kisses whispered through tears. These were not decisions made lightly. They were decisions made with love, shaped by loss. Let's end today in a soft place, by the hearth where an old woman tells a story to a circle of girls spinning wool. She speaks slowly, her voice catching now and then. She's telling the tale of her mother's birth, how her grandmother died and how the baby barely lived. The girls listen, hands busy with thread, but hearts full of questions. One asks softly, "Did your mother have children?" The old woman smiles, "Only me." And suddenly, the silence is thick with understanding. This was how fear passed, not through screams, but through stories, through bloodlines, through the steady eyes of women who had seen too much. Not all peasants avoided family because of hardship or hunger. Some did so because they had looked death in the eye, in the birthing room, by the grave, in the eyes of widowers, and decided they could not bear the gamble. They chose love in other forms, peace in other paths, and their quiet courage deserves remembering. Come, friends, walk with me along a narrow strip of land, a peasant's-only field. It is small, just enough for barley and a goat pen. It was passed down from father to son, and before that, from grandfather to father. But here's the thing, it cannot be divided. The land laws in many medieval villages said so. If a field was split too many times, None of the pieces could sustain a family. So only one child, usually the eldest son, inherited it whole. What about the others? They were left with little. No land, no inheritance. Perhaps a single cow, or a place as a laborer in another man's fields. Some entered the church, others left the village altogether, but some stayed behind. Not married, not parents, just quietly tending the land that wasn't theirs, or waiting until a sibling passed. For many peasants, land meant survival, and without it, starting a family seemed impossible. Now we visit a cottage where the fire burns low and the eldest son sharpens a blade in silence. He has just inherited his father's land, tools, and livestock, and along with them, his debts, duties, and aging mother's care. In some places, inheritance was a crown, in others, a weight. A young man might have dreamed of marriage, but now there is no time. He must sow the fields, repair the barn, pay tithes, and tend to family matters. Some peasants inherited wealth, but more often they inherited struggle. And many, sensing the strain, made a quiet decision. No marriage, no heirs. The burden would end with them. In this way, the pressure of inheritance, intended to ensure continuity, sometimes achieved the opposite. Let us now pause beneath the eaves of the weaver's house, where 3 sisters sit spinning flax. They are of age, their fingers are quick, their cheeks are flushed, but none of them are betrothed. You see, their father has no land left to give, no livestock to offer, no dowry, and without a dowry, a few coins, a cow, or a plot, marriage is nearly impossible. It's not that they're unloved or unwanted, but in the economy of peasant life, love is not enough. So they spin, and help the neighbors, and tend to their ailing aunt. They may never marry, and they know this, but in their weaving, in their laughter, in their sisterhood, they find something close to peace. Now walk with me through the worn paths of a crumbling hamlet. Several cottages are empty, roofs have fallen in, ivy climbs where people once lived. In some places, whole family lines disappeared. Plague, famine, and hard winters wore them down. But even without tragedy, land loss could dissolve a family slowly. Fields sold to pay debts. Inheritance passed to distant cousins. Generations ended not with disaster, but with quiet erosion. In these forgotten spaces, marriage felt futile. Why bring children into a world where there's no space left for them? No home to offer, no future to hand over. This wasn't despair, it was realism. And realism sometimes is the gentlest kind of resignation. Let us end our walk with a shepherd on the hill. His flock is small, his tunic is patched, the wind moves gently across the moor. He owns no land, he was the second son. His elder brother inherited the farm and married a girl from the next village. The shepherd did not, but each morning he rises with the sun. He watches the stars. He walks miles and knows every bend of the earth. He does not long for children, or perhaps he once did, but now he is content. Not all peasants were bitter about what they lacked. Some made peace with simplicity. They chose not to marry, not because they hated love or feared pain, but because the world offered them a different kind of home. A life of stillness, of walking, of watching, of being. And in that choice, there was quiet wisdom. Let's walk softly now into a village courtyard, where the air smells faintly of straw and early apples. A man stands by the well, not speaking much, nodding politely to neighbors, but keeping to himself. He has never married, he has no children. He does his work, pays his dues, shares his bread when asked. But something about him seems gently apart. He never made a speech, never told anyone he was protesting. But his life, quiet, unmarried, without heirs, was a refusal all the same. A refusal to play the game of lineage. A refusal to be measured by children or name. Sometimes resistance in history didn't look like rebellion. It looked like silence. stillness, doing only what felt right for oneself. And for some peasants, that meant stepping away from the path everyone expected them to walk, not with anger, but with peace. Now come with me past the main road, behind the Abbey Gardens, where a woman named Edric grows beans and wildflowers. She's lived here for decades. She weaves baskets and sells them at market. She tends to a few old hens. Her roof leaks sometimes, and her cloak is always patched. But her laugh, oh, her laugh carries like bells. She never wanted to raise children, said she'd helped raise too many already. Her siblings, her cousins' children, neighbors' babies when their mothers needed a nap. Her life is quiet, no legacy in parchment or bloodline, but still her life lingers in memory, in the baskets people carry, in the flowers she gave away freely. She lived in the margins, and from the margins built a whole, full world. Not everyone who stepped outside of marriage or family did so out of sorrow. Some simply found contentment elsewhere. Let's pause in the home of a couple, Thomas and Marin. They married young, as most did, but after 2 difficult births, Marin could no longer carry children safely. The priest urged them to keep trying. Neighbors whispered, but they said no. Instead, they poured their energy into other things. They took in Marin's niece after her sister died. They tended their neighbor's goats while he recovered from illness. They mended roofs, preserved pears, and when people asked, "Why no more little ones?" Thomas would simply say, "Our table is full." It wasn't anger, it wasn't sorrow, it was choice, it was enough. In a world that often demanded more mouths, more labor, more names on the roll, some peasants chose to draw the line, not in cruelty, in love, and in that line they found peace. Now follow me down a cart-worn road that leads away from the village. It's the road many walked only once, to marry, to claim land, to settle. But for some, it was the road not taken. Some peasants stayed behind when marriage offers came. Others left villages rather than be matched with someone they didn't choose. They wandered, worked seasonally, stayed in abbeys, or traveled from town to town, exchanging skills for shelter. To us, it might seem rootless, but to them, it was freedom. From expectations, from the weight of duty, from the fear of repeating the hardships they'd watched in their parents' eyes. They walked quietly, without legacy or fanfare. And in the stillness of that choice, there was dignity. Let's return now to the village green. Children play, old men carve spoons, a woman sets out loaves to cool. Among them are people who had no children, who never married, who lived alone or with friends, who followed paths shaped by care, caution, quiet rebellion, or deep peace. And yet, they are remembered for the way they helped a neighbor rebuild after a fire, for the sweet syrup they made from elderberries, for the stories they told, for the laughter they brought, for the quiet warmth they carried like a lantern through the cold. Legacy doesn't only live in bloodlines, it lives in gestures, in kindness, in decisions made with love, even when those decisions go against what's expected. So I ask you, dear friends, what kind of legacy would you want to leave? One written in names or one remembered in hearts? Let me know softly in the comments. Thank you for walking through this slow and sacred series with me. If you'd like to time travel again soon, you know where I'll be, quietly watching, gently telling, here on Zuzu's Time Travel. Would you like me to now bundle this entire series into a single document for easy reference or upload?